Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to Boundary Break, the show where we basically take a camera anywhere we want in a wide array of games, and in today's episode, we're taking a look at High on Life. But before we delve into the video proper, I have to give thanks to once again Franz Bauma for supplying the camera tool that I used for this episode, and a thank you to our sponsor, Guardian Tales. Guardian Tales is an adventure RPG with a pixel art style, showing sophisticated homage to the classic JRPGs. You play as a Guardian Knight, newly recruited but destined to protect the Canterbury Kingdom from invaders. Wowee! Exploring each world, you will meet other Guardians to save the world together. The classic tale expands to a sci-fi epic that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Get ready to experience an unforgettable journey filled with action, puzzle solving, attractive characters, and thrilling battles. Unleash the full potential of your character with a massive variety of weapons and support characters. Each weapon and character has unique skills, adding strategic depth and excitement to battles. Embark on a thrilling conclusion to the first season of Guardian Tales with the fully updated World 11. The journey with the princess will come to a close as you face a formidable boss and make a pivotal choice that determines your fate. To uncover hidden treasures and uncover hidden stories. Click the link in the description below to download and try out the game yourself. Anyway, back to the video. High on Life actually starts in a bit of an interesting way, with a style reminiscent of earlier 3D shooters for the intro sequence. And while you may have correctly assumed that this area that you play through is rendered in real time, you're really only seeing a flat projection. And if we move the camera around its default position, you can see this a little more clearly. The rest of the world isn't visible during this time, and the room you eventually move around in is just pitch black. But the world does exist. If we put an object between the camera and the TV, it will render in full color, albeit only for the portion that intersects with the bounds of the screen. This includes Lizzie, who is already set up for her introductory cutscene. And I'm sure that you've also noticed the floating arms of the player stretched out into a T-pose. And in case you're wondering where the Buck Thunderworld is stored compared to the house, you'll be happy to know that it's not that far underneath it actually, and until you pick a character, this level remains loaded in. The stage is only modeled as far as you play it for, so while there's not exactly any secret areas at play, it is still cool to look at all this stuff a little closer than you would be able to otherwise. Like these low poly enemies that you really don't get a good look at. They don't really resemble any of the enemy designs you come across later, so this is the only version that we really have of them. The stars are, of course, just animated pixels, but the green planet is a fully 3D model. Here's something that I've still not quite figured out. Inside the house, there's a version of Lizzie that is stored under the stairs, up to and even past the end of the game. But I can't, for the life of me, think of a situation where this version of Lizzie was used for anything, though it's possible that she's used for audio cues or something of the sort. Outside in the neighborhood, though, we do have some stuff to look at. The playable area for this section is small, but the map is surprisingly large. Here's a zoom out to show just the sheer scale of the map compared to what you end up walking through. All of the map is just stored on a large square of terrain, and a huge chunk of it is basically empty, with just a really big line of trees instead of any houses. The Skybox is also comprised of multiple layers, with a smaller grassy ring in the center, and then a cloud image plastered over a dome for the sky. And on closer look, the grassy area just seems to be from an aerial image of a field, with that small image just repeating all the way around. And upon a closer look at some of the houses on your street, I noticed that some of them have reflections in their windows and some don't. Going inside the house also seems to have some pretty strange lighting where the shadows kind of just wiggle around. Oh yeah, and I'm sure that you've noticed that all these houses are empty. That's not the case for all of them though. Like this house that gets teleported on top of. It has a fully modeled interior for all the rooms that end up getting cut open, and the destruction is already part of this scene. Now, for your player's house, there's two different versions of the house's exterior. One for the intro neighborhood, and then the other is used basically for the rest of the game. For the intro neighborhood section, it's a lot more simplified, with basically no modeling around the backside of the house, and no windows along the outside. And there is a difference between the scale of the inside of the house and the outside, with the house being a little wider on the outside than the inside would suggest, but that's consistent throughout the entire game. The inside of your house is just a little bit smaller than the outside. And once you're teleported into Blim City, the outside of the house finally appears, with the back door, porch, and windows finally being added in. And here's a little bit of a better view of Blim City loading in. There are quite a few cubes that we'll cover over the course of this video, but since we're on the topic of Blim City, just outside of the tunnel to the slums, there appears to be a dev cube with some texture tile set. There's no real way to know what the devs of High on Life intended for this cube in particular without talking to them, but the idea that I thought was funnier is that it stores your decision between whether you find the red or blue doorman hotter, though feel free to leave your best guess in the comments below. And now is probably as good a time as ever to talk about the player's character model, or lack thereof. As is the case for many FPS games, the player doesn't actually have a body that they inhabit and is simply a pair of floating arms instead. These arms will accompany you during your entire playthrough. There's not a moment that you're playing the game where the arms are not just hiding off screen somewhere, like here when you're sitting down in the diner. And for some reason, instead of staying in a T-pose the entire time, your arms actually do have somewhat of a walking animation, with both your hands forming into fists and your right arm moving down to your side, which is all just happening right outside the player's view. And even though most of the weapons in High on Life are just held with the one hand, your left arm moves around quite a bit, all things considered, with its default resting position changing between weapons. And during normal gameplay, the most displaced it ever gets is when you're holding the first gun you end up getting, which is Kenny, with the left arm being kind of halfway between the camera's height and the ground, instead of up by your shoulder. This doesn't affect gameplay at all, and all of the other animations have it in a much more reasonable spot. And when you're talking to Kenny, it does rein in the arm just a little bit, even more so when you're holding the knife, because it actually moves it into the right spot, but it's really odd to see it where it is. And one fun trick that the game uses is when you're interacting with this Bounty 5000 machine, you're actually pretty far away from it, and your player model doesn't even touch it at all. The game just uses perspective to its advantage to sync the animation with the screen. And when you have to be covered in goop to blend in, the goop actually covers your arms completely. And there's nothing underneath the surface of your arm, unlike the mercs. And speaking of the mercs, while they don't have anything underneath most of their body, parts of their body are swapped out between gooped and ungooped as they're shot. Looking a bit closer, there are actually visible seams in the model along these dividing lines. And the arm that the merc uses to hold their gun has an ungooped layer visible underneath when the camera is brought up close. The game has a real focus on characters having these really big eyes with overemphasized features like really big eyelids, and we can see that here inside of a Gatlian. And as you can see, inside the head, the two eyelids are completely separate from each other, both animating together to form the blinks. And while this is pretty consistent across the game, some characters have almost indistinguishable eyelids. And some, I'm pretty sure, don't blink at all. And one detail that you might not have noticed if you never looked at the game's character glossary is that Knifey is one of the only characters with a canonical brain, which is attached to the blade part of his head. Crazy, I know, but what's even crazier is that when you use his grapple, his brain detaches out of his head and latches onto whatever object you're aiming at. It's not exactly easy to see in motion, so I figure most players never even noticed. There is one character that just uses a normal gun. His name is Dr. Gergula, and while he's visible in holograms earlier in the game, you can see him in the flesh in a secret area in the Human Haven after finishing the game. Spoilers, I'm sorry. Clug Nugman is also loaded into every zone that you eventually see him in before he's required to be there, which means you can see multiple at a time when this section of the map is unloaded. And here's what the Human Haven looks like when you zoom out of the map. The skybox surrounding it is actually quite small, along with the structure itself, but much like the Buck Thunder portion at the beginning of the game, the planet is a 3D model. though this one is kinda smushed, making it less of a sphere and more of an egg shape. This level of Skybox detail extends to Dregtown as well, where they have a black hole taking up a portion of space instead. And I'm not actually sure how they're pulling off this effect. I don't know if there's any 3D geometry involved or if it's all pulled off with shaders, so if you have an explanation, please leave one. I'd love to learn more about what rendering technique that they're using here. And overall, I'd have to say it's a really good looking effect. I love the look of all the layers coming together as well, especially the background rings. There's also a combination of 3D and 2D stuff that makes up the rest of space, like how the asteroids are 3D models, and the blue light in the sky is just a flat image. The ships flying around are also just billboard textures. For some reason, there's also a lot of stuff stored beneath the map of Dregtown, with a bunch of NPCs randomly strewn about, as well as a cube that appears to be used for some sort of smoke rendering. Dregtown also has a reappearance of one of my favorite rendering techniques ever, interior mapping. I talk more in depth about it in the Spider-Man and Stray videos, but basically the main function of this is to create the illusion of a fully modeled interior without the addition of any actual geometry to the scene. Basically, there's no inside to the building, it's just the window and that's it. It's really cool, and I feel like I do a disservice every time I talk about it because I'm not the best person to go to for this, so please, if you don't know about it, if you're interested in it, please look into it, look it up, read it from cooler people than me. And on a similar note, there are screens that do a similar kind of effect, but instead of creating the inside of a building, they just add depth to the UI on screens, giving them a bit of a 3D look. One thing that I really wanted to mention is that there's these construction worker NPCs, and they have a helmet covering most of their face. They look a little goofy, right? Like, they look a little silly, but if you take the camera inside their helmet, they do have eyes. They got two little dot eyes on their head, which I thought they were completely eyeless, and I don't know, that made it goofier. I like that. It's a little silly. At some point in the game, there are these enemies called gruntons, apparently, and taking the camera inside their head is initially pretty normal with the average fare of eye and mouth model, but then there's a spiky ball, and then flipping the camera around towards the front of the head, we can see that the facial texture on the outside is being wrapped on the inside, displaying what I can only describe as agony. Real quick, I just want to highlight a couple instances of the game loading, like when you're running through the tunnel into the slums, where it loads in the entire bottom area. And I always think it's pretty cool to see how games handle dynamic stuff like this to keep playing as seamless as possible. Here's also a look at what it's like on the outside of the house when you teleport to Gatlas. On the outer edge of the jungle map, there's a text box out of bounds that says, "Explore Zephyr. Appreciate the natural splendor of Zephyr and be introduced to how cute and lil the Fergles are. Difficulty? Easy. Very." The text box also seems to have some sort of time limit on it, maybe a time of day. I think this is from an earlier part in the game's development. At another part of the same map, there are a lot of rocks left floating outside the bounds too, with this particular rock being near what looks to be an untextured shutter or door of some kind, as well as some text that just says toggle defenses. Zephyr overall is actually pretty interesting too. The entire skybox is basically just a spherical image surrounding the entire map, and if we zoom out far enough, we can get a glimpse of the void just outside. There's actually a lot of stuff stored out of bounds in this map in general too, including a lot of the land chunks that can get teleported in. It also gives us a bit of an opportunity to look more at map creation as a whole, especially with interior spaces like caves, which end up having all these black boxes surrounding them to prevent light leaking in from the rest of the ambient light of the map. You can see this and a bit of another trick in the lab area where a lot of the exterior geometry is very simple and just used to close off the outside, using big prefabbed objects as well as black boxes once again. In this case, however, there are also these little domes of light that are meant to represent some sort of light fixture in the ceiling, rather than having like a light bulb or something. And this just seems like a bit of a silly oversight, but there is a slight piece of geometry sticking out from the bathroom of this house in the jungle. It's not out of bounds or anything, I just thought it was funny. In the outskirts, the fog is pretty thick, so it's a little hard to see, but after removing the fog, we can get a good look at the sandworms in the distance. And before they animate coming up out of the ground, they spawn just below it. The animation of them flying across the air is a little janky, but it does get the job done, and then right before the sandworm would be fully submerged, it gets yanked underneath the ground before it despawns. Now it's time for a couple viewer requests. You can keep up to date with the games me and She Says are covering, as well as leave your own requests for future episodes by checking out either of our Twitters. Following also probably couldn't hurt. First up, there was a request to see what Dr. Joopy looks like moving through the pipes, and he just teleports between each end of the pipes he moves through rather than actually going through them, but we can at least see a different angle of the animation where he comes out of the pipe. The next viewer request was to get a zoom out of the mayor's office, and unsurprisingly, there's not any more to the building than the room you can walk around in, with only stuff outside of the windows being rendered in the scene. The city is pretty large too, considering how little of it you can even see from the window. Everything is made of 3D objects, including the cars that are flying around, even if they are just simple shapes. You can see that a lot of the buildings, even the clumps of them, are just reused, being rotated or scaled differently to increase variety. There's even one tower that just is completely turned on its side. There's a small section of the game where you're in a space RV, and while there's a lot of stuff to look at on the inside, like a Cybertruck on one of the shelves, I think the more interesting stuff is happening just outside. Underneath the van, for one, there's a black box for mysterious and possibly dastardly reasons. There's also an effect going on to represent you going really fast, with an animated texture being placed on the inside of this really stretched object that extends pretty far in front of the RV, but not very far behind it. And since this map takes place in space, we see a repeat of the Skybox actually just being a small box that isn't all that far away from the player's position. But for this area, the world's ambient color is actually a light gradient, rather than being a dark color like most of the others. Nipulon's lounge is also pretty cool to peek outside of the map of. For one, there's enemies stored underneath the floor before we even enter, and if we take the camera out once we're inside, we can see a little bit more about how the map is constructed. One particularly goofy effect is that there's an object right in front of the window that is meant to look like there's dust or clouds or something, but it's much larger than you'd think it would need to be and extends almost as far down as the first floor where you initially walk into the area. There's also two versions of Nipulon's office loaded in at once. The normal one, and then one that's connected to a much larger hallway, which is used later in the game when you're fighting Nipulon. There's also, of course, this black sphere that's used as a transitional area, which looks like this on the inside. There's also a cube stored outside of that map for the same section, which looks probably about 10 times bigger than the lounge itself. Here's a zoom out from that section, by the way, to show that it is actually taking place inside the cube. This area of the game is really cool, by the way, and if you played this far into the game, you're probably wondering how they pulled off the effect of you walking forever in either direction. So this is what it looks like to walk through the area normally, but if we keep the camera in place, this is what you're actually doing. You actually only move around in a small portion of the map, with the other parts being scaled up and down versions that you don't interact with at all. They're only there to act as visual markers, so you always have areas that are bigger and smaller than you at all times. And this is repeated for all the areas that you can move around in. As you move, you'll be teleported back to the start of the opposite side you were moving so that it looks like you're still moving in that direction. Your player model also appears to scale up and down depending on your position to make the world look like it grows and shrinks around you. At one point, to progress further, you have to walk into a hole, but since you're not actually moving towards the center of the area, they have to get a bit creative. The hole at the center actually expands at each reset, so if we keep the camera in place, you can see it gets super big in bursts, basically clicking to each size per teleport. But it can only be so small, and that's when you can see visible popping. But from the player perspective, this is almost entirely seamless. As the hole expands, it also unloads the smaller sections of the map. And here's what the smallest scale items look like close up. At the end of the sequence, you also hold up all of your weapons at once, which ends up looking like this from another angle. You may have also noticed that Kenny is floating out of the player's hand, and I'm not sure what causes this, but I have seen it in other playthroughs. This persists until the end of the game, and what's weird about it is I thought it was like a rendering bug or something, where the layer of the gun is rendering over the player model, but there's actually a total misalignment with the arm. And to close the video off, here is a small compilation of low poly areas. Hey everyone, it's me. That's right, it's Snipey. And I'm finally back from my 3-month absence doing whatever is funnier to you, I guess. But the stars aligned, and this video is finally not wasting away in my file explorer. But yeah, you know, do your thing, leave feedback, comments, you know, the whole drill. But yeah, I will see you guys. Yeah. But yeah, I will see you guys in the next one that I make. Hope you have a fantastic day, whatever day you watch this. And, yeah. Resident Evil 4 Remake, I mean, come on, yeah, right?